Hi, I'm Kat, the apprentice maven, and I know some things and I'll teach you, but I don't know a lot more things and I'll teach me too. Mostly though, we're gonna have fun. Let's go. There are several kinds of buttons that you might want to consider depending on your project and what you have to repair. This button is called a shank button. Looks like a normal button on the front, but on the back it's called a shank. And what that does is it lifts the button away from the fabric. This is most important when you have a thicker fabric, like maybe for a skirt or a pair of pants with like a heavy corduroy, or maybe for a jacket. You'll often find shank buttons on the back of those. The other kind of button, which is generally more common on like shirts and things like that, is just regular button with no shank on it. And so this is the kind that I'm going to show you how to use today, because if you have a button that you need to put back onto, say, a shirt or something like that, this is the most common one that you're going to see. And it's also possible to create a shank out of the thread you're going to use. So to get started, the first thing you're going to need is a needle. You're going to need a needle. I also recommend a toothpick. I like to make sure that mine is the round kind. The flat kind doesn't do this as well. You can do this without a toothpick. It's just heckin' harder. Your scissors, and you're going to need some thread. Generally speaking, you either want to match your fabric or the button you're going to use. However, in this case, for this tutorial, I'm going to use contrasting thread just to make it a little easier to see. My thimble's a little weird. This is my thimble that I use when I sew. This is not sponsored. Thread Magic doesn't know who I am, but I like to use Thread Magic. My grandmother used to use wax. I used it for years and years and years, and sure, it helps, but I just like Thread Magic better. It makes the thread feel silkier, smoother, especially if you're using a polyester thread rather than a cotton, silk thread, or linen thread. So Thread Magic is, for me, a lifesaver. It helps prevent tangles. One thing I like to do when I'm sewing on a button is I cut my length of thread, and then I will double it over to create 4 thicknesses of thread once you thread your needle. And the reason for that is buttons get a lot of stress and they pull a lot. So let's see if I can get this on my first try. Almost there. Hey, go team. All right. So, and what you end up with is a nice thick thread. They do make a buttonhole thread that you can use just for this purpose, but I don't have any, and so this is what I do instead. So once you have this threaded, you're going to want to cut the loop so you actually have 4 thicknesses of the thread. It doesn't matter if they're all the same length. We're going to trim them in a second anyway. I take my Thread Magic and I just run the thread through a couple of times. Oop, got a little chunky right there. Fix that. Okay. Sometimes when I'm teaching people how to sew, they will have trouble knotting the thread. So the easiest way that I have found to do it is to take the needle in your non-dominant hand and hold it with the pointy end facing your dominant hand. Then take the ends of your thread and hold them perpendicular to the needle and pinch that between your non-dominant fingers, like that. Then take the thread, wrap it around twice, like that. And so this is what you have. Pinch it and just pull the needle through. And voila, there's your knot. Off camera, I trimmed the thread. I don't know if you can see that, to make it a little bit shorter so it's not quite so obtrusive. I also put my thimble on. As I mentioned before, my thimble is a little strange. This one's more comfortable for me. Most people wear theirs a metal thimble on their middle finger, and it's the kind that goes all the way around. I have a lot of trouble fitting a thimble to myself because I have longer nails, but this one really works well for me, especially the way that I typically sew. Figure out what works for you. There's a lot of different styles of thimble out there. I'm going to talk about them in a different video, but this is the one that I wear. So once you've got your needle threaded and your thread is trimmed, you're going to come through on the back side of your fabric. And I like to put the needle right up against the thimble like this and use that to push the needle through the fabric. So wherever you've decided that you want your button to be, push it through the fabric. Then you'll take your button and you'll go through the first hole. Okay. Now you have to make a decision whether you want to go across your button or diagonally on your button. I like to go across on my button. I find that I like that it's neater that way. So you put your needle through the second hole of your button and pull it through, but don't pull it all the way tight. Leave a little bit loose. So now what you have is your thread is loose against the fabric, but it's through the button. This is where you're going to put in your toothpick. So you're going to slide your toothpick in between these two threads and then pull your button tight. Okay. Now it's a little fiddly, but you're going to want to hold the button and the toothpick right up against the fabric. What this does is it creates that space from the shank button that we had earlier. It creates that space where there isn't one before. So we're going to go through a couple more times. If I can find the hole. Okay, so I was kind of struggle bus, so I did that off camera. I just went through 2 more times, but you can see that because we'd used 4 thicknesses of thread, it's creating a nice sturdy base. So I'm going to go ahead and repeat that in the other 2 holes. Okay, so that's done. The next part's a little bit tricky. What you're going to do is, this is what it looks like on the back, kind of messy, not a big deal. You need to put your thread through to the other side of your fabric, but underneath the button. So the needle has to come out through here. This is another good reason to have the toothpick. Okay, now take your fabric and bunch it up under the button, holding the button away from the fabric. So you should have a little bit of space, and remove your toothpick. You want to keep the button with the same tension on the thread so that it's away from your fabric. Then take your thread and wrap it around the button a couple of times. Okay, once you've done that, that is what creates what's called a thread shank, and that helps keep the button away from your fabric. Then you can put your thread back through to the wrong side of your fabric. And you can see that because we did that, there's a little bit of space in between the fabric and the button. So if we had a thicker fabric and we didn't have a shank button, this is what I would do. And then you just put it under a couple threads of the fabric. off. And do that one more time. Doesn't really matter too much where, but this is why you want to have your thimble, because that was kind of a hard push. If I wasn't wearing a thimble, that probably would have hurt my hands a little bit. All right, and then you take your scissors and you want to cut it off. Leave yourself a little tiny tail, but you don't want to leave too much. Oops. And you're done. So one thing I forgot to mention earlier, and this is the reason I was so struggle bus earlier, I kind of picked a weird button. If you ever need to remove a button, you can just cut the shank threads. That's going to be the easiest way to get your button off of there. Try not to scrape your button too much like I just did. That's going to be the quickest way to do it. And you also have to be careful not to cut your fabric. You definitely use a seam ripper for this. So the reason that I was so struggle bus earlier, ignore all the threads, is because I chose a button that had really, really wide holes on the right side of the button and really tiny holes on the wrong side of the button. Don't be me. Pick an easier button to work with your first time. Practice on a button with big holes, or at least holes that are the same on the front as the back.